My honor to introduce to you our next speaker, Mr. John Berger, U.S. Army retired colonel, was the former CISO and Chief of Cyber Warfare at the United States Central Command here at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida, from 2011 to 2014. In that capacity, he was responsible for the planning and execution of offensive and defensive cyberspace operations in the Middle East and Central Asia. Recently retired, he is currently president and owner of Cybersecurity Insights, LLC, where he advises Silicon Valley cyber technology startups on strategies for success in the federal operation centers by evaluating their ability to rapidly assess risk and prioritize response actions. The title of his presentation today is Evaluating Commercial Cyber Threat Intelligence, and he will help identify the use cases for threat intelligence and provide the audience with some practical evaluation criteria to compare the myriad of offerings. With no further ado, Colonel.
No, thank you. Everybody hear me? I'm going to walk around a little bit. Thanks for everybody at BSides for putting this on, and I am clearly not understanding of the dress code. I'm the only one. I've looked all day, and I'm the only one wearing a tie, but I'm going to go with it. It's just kind of my formal makeup. But thanks you guys for putting this on. It's a great local event, and every one of these things is an operation. I don't care what you say. You got to manage it that way. And how is everybody getting in? Where are they parking? What are they doing? There's logistics. There's ops. There's all that stuff. And sometimes it seems like they're easy things to pull off, but they're not. So thank you very much for everybody and everything that you're doing here. Just want to talk to you a little bit about threat intelligence, and I'm going to query the audience for a minute. How many of you are using some form of threat intelligence today? How many of you think that you are getting the government's best threat intelligence from the government sharing with you? Okay, there's no one fooled. Okay. I will tell you, how many people watched the president talk out at Stanford? All right. There is clearly a desire to share threat intelligence between the public and private sectors and the partnerships. I can tell you from an agent of the government for some period that there are good reasons why some of the best intelligence that our nation has will not be shared even within other parts of the government, nor with the commercial sector. And that I can tell you that as you look at all the different offerings that are coming up, there are some really good threat intelligence on the commercial market today that I think in some sense, it may not be the best that the government has to offer, but it's really good. So we're going to talk about, how do you use it? What are the use cases for it? And then how do you evaluate it? And then I'm probably going to talk for about 30 minutes, maybe 35, and then I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. Next slide. I'm the slide clicker. I'm used to that next slide thing, right? You got to start out with a definition, right? So I'm like, you could pick a number of different ones, but threat intelligence is evidence-based knowledge, often including all those things, which I didn't put in blue, about an existing or emerging threat used to inform decisions regarding the subject's response to a hazard. So that's a lot of words to say, hey, it's another input to inform response, right? And we'll talk about more of that here as we go forward. Yeah, you can change the slides if you want. Next slide. Okay, a couple of stats here. What I would call a hyper growth phase of threat intelligence. You can see the numbers up there, kind of the market that we're headed towards, 1.5 billion by 2018. Kind of higher growth demand from two specific areas. One is machine-readable threat intelligence, which are that threat intelligence that you can automate. And many of you would love to automate. I know I would. The last thing I wanted was more data to have a human review, right? If I can get data that I'm confident in to make automated blocking decisions that's driven by a very large infrastructure of intelligence, I would love to be able to do that. But then the other thing is it's driven by tailored and customized analysis based on specific requirements that the vendor has or that the customer has. I will tell you that most, what we see is most more sophisticated, mature security organizations are the ones that are looking into threat intelligence. It's kind of like saying you don't necessarily need to arm Neighborhood Watch with a nuclear weapon. Sometimes these services are very expensive, and they're not necessarily suited, the high-end services, for smaller organizations because they can be somewhat costly. And then you can see here, what I'm going to try to help you do is, there's so many offerings, and everybody says, we're doing cyber threat intelligence. Everybody. You're seeing it everywhere. So I'll kind of try to help you wade through some of the things to look for. So it's increasingly difficult to, differentiate the offerings in the market today. So let's put it all in context. This is kind of the CISO's problem, right? And really, it's about situational awareness, and it's about managing risk on a number of different time horizons. So let me kind of explain this equation. I used to write this up on my board because this is the equation that we really need to always think about, and it's the risk equation. So it's the likelihood that a threat with capability and intent could exploit a vulnerability and have an impact, right? And that together equals risk. So we're evaluating risk on a number of different time horizons, and I'll talk about that because you're evaluating risk on short time horizons, here and now. You're evaluating risk in a campaign way in maybe months to weeks to months. And then, quite frankly, you're evaluating risk on a very long strategic time horizon. But you're always doing this. It's just a matter of what intel should help us feed it. So to put it in context, we're looking for the threat here, the capability intent of a human threat is what we're going to talk about today, and how you can get a service to help you with this part of the equation. There's other threats out there, right? Lots of them, right? There's, natural threats, right? There's environmental threats that are inside your server rooms when it gets too hot, right? Or it floods. There's all kinds of other threats. But there's a human threat, both insider and outsider. And the outsider piece to this is what I'm going to be talking about, capability intent of external adversaries. The thing that remains the same is that the measure of effectiveness for a CISO is the same, right? That is, the CISO is charged with preserving the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of critical infrastructure, right, and data. That has not changed at all. What's his measure of performance? Do it for very little money, right? Do it for the least amount of money. Those things haven't changed. So what we're trying to do is help that CISO get to that risk equation, maintain its measure of effectiveness, and do it at a lower cost. So none of that has changed. So let's talk there are a lot of attack life cycles, but when we look at this in the government, it's pretty simple to understand. It starts with somebody that has a malicious idea, hires a hacker, right? They have some common vision to take over the world or some other such, shared motivation. They develop a weapon, right? They test the weapon, in this case, some sort of cyber weapon, develop malware. They do some reconnaissance, look at what targets they want to go after. They get a dropper, and they deliver a payload. Now let's talk about the attack cycle in terms of intelligence. I can tell you right now that blue wedge is where 90% of cybersecurity investments go. 90%, right? And that rest of the attack cycle, very little study is going into that part of the attack chain. A lot of times we talk about attack chains, about what's happening on the objective, right? We talk about, well, they get in, they escalate, they pivot, they escalate privileges. We're talking about the adversary after they're already on actions on the objective, right? Right? We're analyzing the bullet as it's ripping into the target, right? So we kind of want to get ahead of it, and one of the ways that you do that is with threat intelligence. So let's talk about use. Let's talk about where it applies, and what are the sources of threat intelligence. So if you look at the upper left-hand corner, my organization, right? I typically refer to this as premise intel. So if you haven't mastered your own domain and you don't know what's connected and you're not taking all those feeds from your security devices, your logs, and all of those, even forensics data, into some sort of SIM, right, and looking at those characteristics that would alert you, that's one very important and very necessary source of intelligence. No question about that. But you're just looking at your own self, right? You're looking at your area of operations, the things you control, so it's a very inward focus, right? What is the next kind of phase in this, where I think some of our more mature organizations are already there or moving towards that? You can call it kind of neighborhood watch up to sector watch, right? And it's kind of a vendor and or a consortium. So you have an IPS, you have a firewall, next generation, you have Palo Alto, you have a FireEye. Essentially, they're taking all these enclaves, and you are kind of benefiting from a patient zero construct, right? Somebody's been hit, they're going to take that signature, and you're going to automatically get it, right? So there are just like it's very similar to the antivirus, but it's the same concept. You're taking all these different enclaves, and you're getting a picture of their premise intel. So you're just multiplying your premise by a number of others. It's valuable and it's important, but it's not enough. It's not enough today. The last source here is who is looking at the broader internet outside the premises or the collective premises to see what an adversary is doing, A, in their safe havens, or B, in the key avenues of approach that they're going to use to attack you, right? So you're talking about how do companies have access to the dark nets, the dark web, and the places where these adversaries do their work. That is an essential area of interest that will affect you if you don't know what's going on. And it affords you the opportunity to get ahead of that attack cycle in a time sequence that is more suitable than reacting, okay? And I put these real cool heat maps on the bottom, but this one is clearly, you're on a treadmill here, right? When you're just looking at yourself and looking for indicators, you're just looking at what can I do to hopefully reduce the mean time to detect the adversary and mitigate it before he does something. You're on a treadmill of detect and respond, right? That's what you're on when you're just here, right? You get a little bit more proactive, assuming you're not always patient zero, when you move to kind of the neighborhood watch or the sector watch, right? You kind of move that proactive needle to the right. And then finally, the more you know about who is coming after you and why, the more time you're going to have to prepare better protective measures, better ways to detect what they do, and ostensibly quicker response, right? So you can reduce that real vulnerability window to detect and then respond quicker. Referenced these a little bit a few minutes ago, but really there's, and I come from a military background, and there's literally 3 cycles that we use. And you actually are doing this today in your organizations. You just might not recognize it. What I'll do is I'll tell you kind of what are those time horizons that you're making risk decisions, what are typically the intelligence products that you want to inform those decisions, and what can you do with them? And it's a bit simplified, but I think it'll convey the story. The first one is your SOC, right? You're talking about responding in seconds to minutes, perhaps days, right? You're in a very short, current operations type of decision cycle. Typically, you're working off of indicators of compromise, right? I mean, you're looking at SIMs, you're looking at either malware, binaries, hashes, you're looking at IP addresses, you're looking at domains, you're looking at URLs, you're looking at those things that you can actually pick up on a machine, right? That's the type of intelligence that you need in order for you to do something very quickly, right? To get it back into a machine that's a friendly machine and get it to do something for you, right? Either issue an automated block, take some of these things and put them into your SIM to enrich it, to say, okay, I want to look at all the bad IPs that someone has sent me. Can I correlate that against what's coming into my environment, and does that give me more context for what I should do? It should. it should. That should send your alert levels up a little higher in that SIM. And then finally, if you got some sort of phishing signature or whatever, there's advisories to users. We used to do that all the time. And don't forget about that component of your program. Intelligence can help with informing your users when there's an issue. So the second part I'm talking about, kind of your kind of what I would call future operations. Hopefully you're into the weeks to months type timeline. And what you're doing there is the key piece of the intel that you use is your techniques, tactics, and procedures, or TTPs, right? You want to understand exactly how does this adversary get into your network, right? What vulnerabilities do they use, right? Do they use people vulnerabilities? Do they use machine vulnerabilities? How do they C2? How do they pivot? How do they escalate privileges? And you can get that type of data, and then you can develop a campaign around it, right? You can say, now that I know exactly how they behave, how can I better protect myself, right? What can I inform users of for the phishing? What CVEs do I need to execute on? How do I need to instrument better for that? And then if it does come, how am I prepared to respond if I'm not already protected? In order to make those types of decisions, you have to get down to the TTP level of fidelity. That's the type of fidelity that you're going to need to make that kind of campaign. It allows you to push out just a bit, right? And that's very similar to, and then finally, I'm going to talk about the last one. Oftentimes, that kind of intelligence, to be honest with you, you're not going to find commercially. So let me give you an example. Our government studies where foreign actors are in their technology acquisitions and whether they're going to, 1028, 48, all those different levels of encryption, who they're talking to, and they're really looking at what are the capabilities of the adversary and what are their intent? What are they really trying to go after? But they're focused on the evolving and emerging capabilities. My experience is that the commercial industry will get there, but they're not yet there. You can make some decisions on kind of acquisition of technology with TTP data, but it's really when you want to make good decisions on what you should buy and what you should move to, you want to really understand where's the bad guy going, right? Where is he going in the future? So on my kind of months to year timeline, I can talk to, what do I need to buy, right? That's the kind of decision that it informs. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how you evaluate these threat offerings. There's no surprise here that the same kind of metrics that we apply to any intelligence offering apply here, right? So essentially, good cyber threat intelligence is relevant to the customer, is obviously accurate, is timely, reliable, and actionable, right? If it's the top four, it's going to be this with a couple of caveats that I'll go after, right? So let's talk about those. Relevant. There's two aspects of relevance. One is the breadth and scope. Typically in cyberspace, you care about what's affecting you right now, and you also care about what might affect you in the future, right? And in order to have that in cyberspace, because of the global nature of the domain, they have to have global reach, A, and B, they have to have some sort of focus. Some threat companies focus on certain adversaries, and they're stronger in focusing on Chinese adversaries, criminal hackers, right? Or, Iran actors, or a number of different actor sets. So some are stronger on some actor sets than others. Accuracy. Accuracy is typically driven by the number of sources and methods that they use. And it accurately characterizes threats, capability, and intent. Timely, obviously, before an attempted exploit. Reliable, always available and dependable. And then finally, actionable, which really means specific enough for you to do something about it. As an operator in Central Command, my intelligence guys used to come and, they tell me all kinds of interesting things, right? Be careful when you go evaluate these providers, because they're going to tell you what they know, but that may not have anything to do with what you need, right? So be very, very, put a lot of scrutiny on, yeah, that's interesting, but not relevant to me, right? So interesting is interesting, but relevant means that you're able to make a risk decision with it. So be very, very draconian about that. So I'll go down each one of those. There's some sub-elements in this brief that I talk to each one of them. So let's talk about relevance. A couple of things, right? So first, we kind of talked about the first one, global reach and applicability. But then, if you look at the diagram there, obviously you care the most about what threat's coming at you, right? You have to have a certain amount of instrumentation within your actual premise to know what's coming at you. So a threat provider is going to need to have some sort of access to your data to understand, or your perimeter to know what's coming at you. But it's the most relevant. Some want to know, I need to know more increasingly what's my partners and my upstream providers, right? What's their risk, right? I want to know about my supply chain, because if they go down, I'm in trouble. And then finally, there's a sector. Well, the sector, again, that's more about that patient zero. What's going on in the financial sector? Who's going after? What criminal groups are going after the banks? Well, they all share information through their ISACs, right? And that's kind of the sector. It's, as you go outside here, you can see where it's less relevant. So you ought to, make sure that you understand when you look at a vendor, how specific are they able to get to what you care most about, which is obviously yourself, right? Use cases, we kind of talked about the different use cases. When you're in current operations, you really want it to be machine readable. If you're getting into the weeks to months, you're going to want to look at TTPs. And then if you're in the future plans, you want to really understand their evolving intentions and capabilities. And then finally here, the collection management. You really want to understand, and this is where you're going to get a lot of them, okay? You ask them, they say, I provide this type of intelligence. Well, that's great. How flexible are you to tune your collection platform to my needs, right? So if I'm interested in knowing about a specific adversary at a certain time, are you willing to put more of your assets to collect on that intelligence priority for me at the expense of other customers they might have, right? So how flexible are they to tune that collection platform to your needs based on priority intelligence requirements that you specify to them? And this will be one of the things that differentiates in the future is how disciplined are they in following this process. You'll find that a number of them are very, very strict in here's what I give you, like it or not, okay? Accuracy, source variety. There are a number of different sources that there are flow sensors, there are honeypots, there are crawlers. There's a number of different sources that these providers use. There's human operatives that some of them use, right? So how many different sources in terms of variety do they use? And then how do they corroborate that intelligence? Obviously, the more sources you have and the more corroboration there is, the more accurate the intelligence is. So typically, when I would get intelligence, well, one agency saw it, did the other agencies corroborate it, right? And if you get multiple ints to corroborate something, it gets a much higher confidence level. Historical context. Some have historical context where they'll keep certain IOCs for years, and you can see what's going on this IP address or URL back 2 or 3 years. That's good, right? Then you get some context around the historical maliciousness or not of that IP. Also, how long have they been following certain groups? Have they been following these groups and they're really good and they understand and they know all the Twitter handles and all their handles on the bulletin boards and dark webs? There are some companies that know them that well, and they can see when there's a whole bunch of new handles coming up on those nets and whether they're talking with the old guys. Okay, these are new hackers, right? That's the kind of insights that they'll have. And then finally, if you do have machine readable stuff, what's their false positive rate, right? And how do they measure it? You're probably not going to get a good number from them. The best way to do it is call any references and find out what is their false positive rate. Speed. Couple things with speed. Obviously, timeliness If you're getting machine readable, you definitely want to have something that is fast, right? If you're going to be making automated decisions, well, then when there is some change in an indicator that they pick up on, and they're going to issue you a change in a threat score, for example, how quick is that threat score changed? And actually, then you want to know, how current is it? So, for example, you all know, you get this blacklist, right? Hey, when is that IP address no longer, it might have been bad yesterday, but it's not bad today, right? And I'm an e-commerce site, and all of a sudden I've got all these false positives because, there was some malicious IP that was associated with domain ABC, and now it's no longer doing anything bad. So how do they age that out, and how do they keep it current, right? And then predictive. How far out on that attack cycle do they go, right? So that you can get out in front of what the bad guy's doing. And reliability. The first two are very, very, these are typical, right? So what is their availability rates? If something goes wrong with a feed and a connection, how quick are they to support? Those are all normal, right? I mean, those are all things that we usually talk to vendors about. The last one, though, is very important. What you're going to find today in this field is that there are a number of vendors that will take open source feeds, right? And they'll take public feeds or a number of different feeds, and they'll put them all together and run some magic, right? And all of a sudden, they got something better, and they're selling it. So really look at how much of the sensor grid do they actually own, right? Is it run and operated by them, or are they relying on someone else or a number of different vendors to pull that data in? Because that's going to go towards your risk and reliability that data, because they have to manage the relationship, they have to manage all of that downstream business if they don't own their own sensor grid. They're also not going to be able to respond as quickly to your changing needs if they don't own the sensor grid, right? And then finally, actionable. Actionable goes towards, well, if it's machine readable, can I integrate it, right? Actionable goes towards, if I get a whole bunch of reports on TTPs, do I have people that can do the analysis on them and figure out what do I need to do, right? How do I turn a threat report, if it's in some document type of format, into action, right? And sharing. Not as big of an issue with commercial threat providers, but one of the benefits of commercial threat providers for you all is that it's invariably all unclassified. So the only inhibition of you sharing it is the sensitivity of releasing it, right? So you'll also want to understand how the vendor might handle that data too. But the good news is it can be shared with all the stakeholders, and just make sure there are no inhibitions. And what's the scope of that? So you buy this service with a company and you want to share it with one of your subcontractors. Is that allowed, right? What's the scope of the Intel subscription you bought? Can you share those indicators with somebody that's down, or is that more expensive, right? And just be very clear when you have that discussion in terms of the sharing scope. And then finally, I'll just summarize, and I'd like to open up for questions. It's really an increasing and an essential component of a good cybersecurity program. As you mature your program, having some capability to get threat intelligence into your program is going to be increasingly important. I think it's in a hyper-growth phase, and I think we're going to see more consolidation in the next 3 years. In the meantime, I think you're going to see that there's kind of two groups, right? There's, in terms of functions, one that looks at really rapid intelligence, machine-readable type, and you're going to see those that are giving you the reports, right? Eventually, I think there might be some consolidation. You may see yourself having more than one vendor. Make sure that you look at what decisions you want the intelligence to inform in your own organization before you even start having any discussions with them. And then hopefully you got some tips today to do your homework when you have a discussion with them. So pending any of your questions, that concludes my my brief, but I'd be happy to take them. Go ahead.
Beyond the immediate security, you're also competitor analysis where increased activity might be indicative of mergers and acquisitions or new product development.
I'm not sure I'm understanding the nuance. So Yes.
And particularly, you might be concerned about a focus on some activity that you have going on, such as you're ready to buy a large company. And by the same token, if we were looking at your competitor, you might see some focus of activity or attention or threat pattern that says, "Ooh, maybe those guys are trying to do something and help you figure out what your competitors are."
So what I've seen is, I have one instance where a nation state was actually compromising an acquisition, the company that was going to acquire another one because they didn't want them to acquire that nation's company. No, I mean, that gets down to, yeah, so let me try to, what I'm going to do is kind of address this a little more broadly. A lot of these companies, based on the platforms that they operate, can do intelligence collection for more use cases than just defense. But I can tell you it's a very, very sensitive area, and it's actually very difficult because it hasn't been regulated, right, in terms of, how are they doing their methods? You start getting into, what they call ITAR issues, which are, the export of weaponry to other nations and that kind of thing. So there are other use cases that a lot of these providers can help with. What I try to talk to you about is the defensive use case, right? You want cyber threat intelligence to inform your defensive actions. Our government and others use intelligence they gain in cyberspace for a whole host of other reasons. And most of these companies are going to stay clear of a lot of that because it gets them, associated with the government, which they don't want to be, right? Because you got to be careful. A number of companies did get very close to some of our agencies, and once they become associated with intelligence agencies, guess what happens to their sales overseas? Right? Down. Right? So if you're a provider of global equipment, a network provider or a desktop provider, and you're perceived as working with the government intelligence providers, that's exactly what's going to happen. These threat intelligence providers are very, very careful to avoid some of that, okay? Because they want to be global. They want to provide global threat intelligence for the broader good to support defense, right? Could they be providing intelligence to support offense? Absolutely could. Absolutely could. Many of them could. Some do, and then they just go all in with the government. But if you try to do both, you won't succeed.
These GTI vendors have a working relationship with like EHS, given the strategic importance of the internet to U.S. commerce. It seems like there's a nexus that should occur between the government entity like the Department of Homeland Security.
Yep.
To work with the global threat intelligence.
Yeah, no, it's happening, right? Yeah, no, Homeland Security has a couple tasks out now to do some evaluations of threat intelligence providers. And I do some consulting work for one of them. That's why I'm very interested in the area. So I know that the government clearly understands that based on the collection methods that a number of them use, whether they're human sources or, some of them use a very, very large scale honeypot network. That's not the same way that our government collects, right? Our government under their authorities, can go into bad guys' networks, right, inside their networks, right? They can get close access with other authorities inside their networks, and they can do all kinds of things. Commercial providers cannot do that because it's illegal, right? They don't have the authorities to do that. They collect differently, but I can tell you the way that they collect that's different is actually complementary, and they pick up different things than our government does because of that, right? So it's the combination of the two that makes for a very potent mix as far as the government's concerned. I'm getting a hard question from Nate.
Two questions. Are you aware of any other threat intelligence providers that are non-United States vendors? And are they any good? the second question is, what do you recommend? Who is consuming this threat intelligence? Is it your just typical operator that's running the SIM consuming this threat intelligence, or you recommend having some type of intelligence analyst that might consume this?
Yeah, obviously, I think I can talk to both of those. If you're doing the machine readable stuff, right, I think there's two use cases for it. One is, depending on how much you trust it, certain machine readable threat intelligence typically comes with some sort of score, right? So the use case for that is, hey, I'm willing to block, if I have enough, say it's a score from 0 to 100, I'm going to block everything that's 100. If this guy says it's 100, I'm just going to block, and then let's see what the false positive rate is. If they're good, there should be 0 false positives. And then you can kind of go down the risk score. Then what a number of them do is they take the rest of it and they'll say, I'm not willing to block on that, but I want to correlate that, list, domain list, IP list, against what's coming into my network, right? So then that's the SIM use case where the analyst is looking at it. If you get TTP reports, I can tell you the only way to really turn that into action is to have humans analyze it, right? You're really going to have, as soon as somebody's handing you a report, guess what you have to do to it? You got to read it, right? You got to read it, you got to analyze it, and you're going to have somebody translate that into something that you can use, right? So if you have those resources, and I would take a couple of people that, one might be able to go out to all the open source, and there's a number of open source things that are somewhat valuable. Even your ISAC data or whatever you have, and if you get a purchased, kind of TTP feed, you're going to need an analyst group, not maybe that big, to help process that and turn it into action. You're just going to. Start with one, right? And if you don't have any money to buy anything, just look at someone who has some intelligence tradecraft. I can tell you now that, there are a number of intelligence analysts who think and have the tradecraft to think about bad guys. That are wanting to get more involved in the cybersecurity business. Because guess what? When they get out of the service, say they were an air intel analyst. Well, there aren't many airlines hiring air threat analysts because fortunately we don't have to. But they have a very good tradecraft to apply to the cyber domain, and they just need to pick up some cyber skills. And they're pretty smart folks. So I think there's the opportunity to pick up some very bright, enthusiastic folks that can take a tradecraft and apply it to the cyber domain and help you. They don't always have to be this, what I call a unicorn, which is this intelligence brain with a forensics brain. They're hard to find, right? Very hard to find. You have to sometimes you have to have two to make one, right? I don't know if I answered your question, Nate. Time horizons? Yeah. You want me to put that up there again?
Are you suggesting that the commercial providers can operate in security areas?
What I'm suggesting is actually you and your company make risk decisions on these timelines, right? So depending on the size of your company, you're making risk decisions in the SOC at seconds, maybe go to days, right? As you do the analytic work you do within a SOC. And then you have analytic work that may take a little longer than days, right? Where if you get TTP data, you can actually have a team that's what I would say would be a small team that's off to the side, maybe not in the SOC floor, but really looking at campaign level data, right? And then you obviously have programs in engineering, and a lot of folks have a program shop. Okay, how can threat intelligence inform their decisions on what to buy, right? So the purpose of this was to say, you really make these risk decisions on these time horizons, and what threat intelligence would inform those decisions. That's the purpose of the chart. Yeah, I would tell you that the place where most of the commercial providers are operating is here and here, right? And here there's not much there. I'm not saying there's none, but there's probably not a huge market for that, right? I just haven't seen it, and somebody may. Yeah. I mean, you can make some decisions on current TTPs if you project into the future, hey, this is what they're doing today. My experience is the only ones that are looking at what's in the future is our government more than anything, right? And they're just trying to stay ahead of it from a very strategic national security interest technology perspective, right? It's just like, hey, we want to keep up with who's building a better nuke, right? Who's building a better encryption, who's building a better cyber bomb, right? I mean, that's at the very strategic national security level. It's not necessarily where our companies today are focused. Okay.
What do you think about features or services or a certain mix of product with the threat intelligence, like FireEye, even all those other services that are virtuals?
Yeah. Here's what I think. I think two things. One, they're going to start buying some pure play companies and integrate their threat feeds into it, right? So you're going to see some consolidation there. But I think that the pure plays in kind of the TTP analysis, there's always going to be some pure plays in terms of just pure play cyber threat intelligence companies where they may help power a device, but they could also provide TTPs, right? So what I think is that I would just ask, what's the sources and methods of these? I would not say no to any of them unless they're useless and you find they're all false positives, right? I would absolutely leverage them, but I'd want to know what is behind the threat intelligence that they are offering inside that appliance, right? So tell me exactly how you're collecting those MD5 hashes or signatures. Tell me exactly how you're putting a reputation score on the IP address. How are you doing that? Because if you don't think that it's very good or you really start trying to use it, you may want to go out and get something else. Yeah, they'll tell you they will tell you their approach, right? They will typically tell you their approach without disclosing what countries they might be in, or and they'll tell you probably their breadth and depth. I found that because otherwise how do they differentiate themselves, right? Then you end up having to try them and see if their stuff is picking up stuff, and then you just kick them out. So they gotta give a little bit in order to get in the door. No. Yeah, I know it's being recorded, and I used to be an agent of the government, but I think I talked about this in the beginning.
I think the government's job, I think DHS should be providing that arguably because it's so strategic to the United States.
Yeah.
The internet and cyber health is important to.
Yeah, so go ahead, shut that off. Can you stop?